What if the most powerful weapon against psychological suffering isn't a complex therapeutic technique or years of deep analysis, but a single question that instantly exposes the illusion your negative thoughts depend on? Beck spent 5 decades studying the architecture of human distress and discovered something that contradicts everything most people believe about combating negative thinking. The conventional wisdom says you should challenge negative thoughts with positive affirmations, replace dark thinking with optimistic alternatives, or simply try to distract yourself when negativity arises. But Beck found that none of these approaches address the fundamental mechanism by which negative thoughts derive their power. And worse, they often strengthen the very patterns they're meant to disrupt. What he discovered instead was that negative thoughts collapse under a single, precisely aimed question that doesn't fight them, doesn't argue with them, and doesn't try to replace them, but simply illuminates the invisible assumption they require to maintain their grip on you. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly what that question is, why it works when everything else fails, and how to wield it in the exact moment when negative thinking threatens to overwhelm you. If you're committed to understanding the actual mechanics of psychological transformation, rather than collecting surface-level techniques that don't penetrate to the root, subscribe now, because what follows isn't theory. It's the precise methodology that dismantles negative thinking at its foundation. Negative thoughts don't operate the way most people imagine. They don't derive their power from being particularly convincing arguments or from reflecting genuine truths about reality. They derive their power from bypassing your critical faculties entirely, from presenting themselves not as interpretations to be evaluated, but as self-evident facts that require no examination. When a negative thought arises, "I'm inadequate. This situation is hopeless. Everyone thinks I'm foolish. It doesn't feel like an idea you're considering." It feels like direct perception of reality, like simply noticing what's obviously true. And this is the key to its power. As long as the thought maintains this status as apparent fact rather than revealing itself as interpretation, as long as it operates beneath the threshold of conscious examination, you're defenseless against it. You can't question what you don't realize is questionable. You can't challenge what presents itself as unchallengeable truth. The single question Beck discovered cuts directly through this illusion. It doesn't attack the content of the negative thought. It doesn't try to prove the thought wrong or replace it with something more positive. It simply asks, "Where's the evidence?" 3 words that seem almost too simple to be transformative. But their simplicity is deceptive because they target the exact mechanism by which negative thoughts maintain their authority. The question forces the thought to justify itself, to provide grounds for the certainty it's been claiming, to demonstrate that it's actually based on reality rather than on distorted interpretation, selective perception, or habitual negativity. And when negative thoughts are required to provide evidence, when they're forced out of their position as self-evident truth and into the position of claims requiring justification, something remarkable happens. They almost never survive the examination. The reason this single question is so devastating to negative thinking is that it exposes a truth Beck spent decades documenting. Negative thoughts are almost always based on either no evidence at all, or on evidence so selective and distorted that it can't withstand even minimal scrutiny. You think you're inadequate. Where's the evidence? Your mind might point to a recent failure, a criticism you received, a skill you haven't mastered. But that's not evidence of global inadequacy. That's evidence that you're human, that you make mistakes, that you're still learning in some areas. The thought inadequate is a totalizing judgment about your entire being. Yet the evidence your mind can produce supports only the much more limited and far less devastating claim that you sometimes struggle with certain things. The gap between the evidence and the conclusion is enormous, but as long as you never ask for the evidence, you never notice the gap. This is where most approaches to combating negative thinking go wrong. They accept the thought's framing and then try to argue against it within that frame. The thought says you're inadequate, and you try to counter with evidence of adequacy, listing your accomplishments, reminding yourself of your strengths, attempting to build a case for the opposite conclusion. But this approach actually reinforces the thought's power, because it accepts the premise that adequacy or inadequacy is something that can be determined by accumulating evidence, and it keeps you focused on the same question the negative thought wants you focused on: am I adequate or inadequate? The single question, "Where's the evidence?" works differently. It doesn't argue about whether you're adequate. It reveals that the concept of global adequacy or inadequacy is itself a distortion. that you're trying to apply an absolute binary judgment to something that's actually complex, contextual, and always mixed. When you ask, "Where's the evidence?" and actually examine what your mind produces, you discover patterns that characterize negative thinking across virtually all contexts. The evidence is always selective, focusing exclusively on data that supports the negative conclusion while ignoring or minimizing everything that contradicts it. The evidence is almost always inadequate to support the sweeping nature of the conclusion. The thought is absolute: "I always fail, nobody likes me, everything is hopeless." But the evidence supports at most a qualified claim about some specific situations. And perhaps most importantly, the evidence is almost always interpreted through the most negative possible lens. Where neutral events are seen as negative, ambiguous situations are read as threatening, and normal human limitations are treated as fundamental flaws. Beck observed that this process of evidence examination doesn't just challenge individual negative thoughts. It begins to reveal the entire cognitive infrastructure that generates and maintains negative thinking. You start to see that your mind has a systematic bias toward negative interpretation, that it doesn't neutrally process information and arrive at conclusions but actively constructs narratives that confirm pre-existing negative beliefs. The question, "Where's the evidence?" interrupts this automatic construction process. It creates a pause between the thought's arrival and your acceptance of it as truth, and in that pause, examination becomes possible. The thought can no longer operate beneath awareness, presenting itself as obvious reality. It's forced into the light where its lack of evidential foundation becomes visible. What makes this single question so powerful is that it works regardless of the specific content of the negative thought. Whether you're convinced you're about to fail at something important, or that you've irreparably damaged a relationship, or that you're fundamentally unlikable, or that your life is meaningless, the question "Where's the evidence?" applies equally. It doesn't require you to understand complex psychological theory or to master elaborate therapeutic techniques. It simply requires you to insist that your thoughts justify themselves before you believe them, to treat negative thoughts the way you'd treat any other claim about reality that someone asked you to accept, with a basic demand for supporting evidence. But here's what's crucial to understand about how this question functions in practice. Asking "Where's the evidence?" isn't a one-time event that permanently dismantles a negative thought. It's a practice that must be repeated because negative thoughts are habits, and habits don't disappear after one challenge. Your mind has been practicing negative thinking for years, possibly decades. It has well-worn neural pathways dedicated to generating negative interpretations, and these pathways don't dissolve just because you've questioned them once. What happens instead is that through repeated practice of asking for evidence, through consistently refusing to accept negative thoughts at face value, and insisting they justify themselves, you gradually weaken those habitual pathways, while strengthening new ones based on evidence-based thinking rather than automatic negativity. The practice begins with recognition. You have to notice when a negative thought has arisen, which is more difficult than it sounds because these thoughts often operate so quickly and automatically that they bypass conscious awareness entirely. You feel terrible, and you assume the feeling is a direct response to your circumstances, not recognizing that between the circumstances and the feeling, there was a thought. Someone doesn't text you back and you feel anxious and hurt. But between their silence and your emotional response, there was a thought. They're upset with me, I said something wrong, they're pulling away. That thought, not the unanswered text itself, generated the emotional response. Learning to catch these thoughts as they occur, to slow down the process enough to see the interpretation your mind inserted between event and emotion, is the first essential skill. Once you've identified the thought, you ask the question, "Where's the evidence?" And this is where precision matters. You're not asking whether you can imagine evidence or whether evidence might exist somewhere. You're asking what actual, verifiable evidence currently supports this specific thought. Your mind will often try to satisfy this question with speculation, with possibilities, with feelings. I feel like they're upset with me. I can imagine scenarios where they'd be upset. But feelings aren't evidence and possibilities aren't evidence. Evidence is observable facts, things they've actually said or done, patterns in their behavior, concrete data rather than interpretation or imagination. When you hold the line and insist on actual evidence, most negative thoughts fail immediately because they have none. Sometimes your mind will produce what appears to be evidence, but is actually just more interpretation. They seemed distant in our last conversation. Seemed according to whom? According to your mind, which is already primed to interpret ambiguity negatively. What specifically did they say or do that could only be interpreted as distance rather than as distraction, fatigue, preoccupation with something else, or any number of neutral explanations? The question, where's the evidence, requires you to distinguish between facts and interpretations of facts. And this distinction is where negative thinking most often reveals its lack of foundation. What feels like overwhelming evidence for your negative thought turns out to be a handful of ambiguous events that you've interpreted through a negative lens, and once you separate the facts from your interpretation, the thought loses its apparent obviousness. Beck discovered that certain types of negative thoughts are particularly vulnerable to evidence examination. Thoughts involving predictions about the future collapse under the question, where's the evidence, because there can be no evidence for what hasn't happened yet. You're convinced the presentation will be a disaster, that the relationship will end badly, that you'll never achieve your goals. Where's the evidence? There is none. There can't be. You're treating a prediction, a speculation about possible futures, as if it were an established fact about present reality. The question exposes that you're suffering over something that exists only in your imagination, something that may never occur, and that your anxious mind is dramatically more likely to catastrophize than to accurately predict. Thoughts involving mind reading similarly crumble when you ask for evidence. You know what someone else is thinking, usually something negative about you. Where's the evidence? Unless they've explicitly told you what they're thinking, you have none. You have interpretations of facial expressions, tones of voice, behaviors, but these are all ambiguous and consistent with multiple different thoughts. Your certainty that you know what they're thinking isn't based on evidence. It's based on your mind's tendency to assume others are thinking negative things about you, a tendency that says far more about your habitual thought patterns than about what's actually occurring in anyone else's consciousness. Global negative judgments about yourself are perhaps the most common target of this question, and the most likely to collapse under examination. I'm a failure. I'm unlovable. I'm incompetent. Where's the evidence? If you actually examine your life comprehensively rather than selectively, you find mountains of evidence that contradicts these absolute judgments. You've succeeded at countless things. You have people who care about you. You've developed skills and knowledge and contributed value in numerous ways. The negative judgment can only be maintained by systematically ignoring all evidence that contradicts it, while focusing exclusively on evidence that supports it. And the question, where's the evidence, forces you to look at the complete picture, rather than the distorted selection your negative mind prefers. What happens through consistent practice of this question is that you develop what Beck called cognitive distancing. You stop being merged with your thoughts, stop experiencing them as reality itself, and start relating to them as mental events that may or may not accurately represent reality. A thought arises, and instead of automatically accepting it as true, you pause and ask whether it's actually supported by evidence. This pause, this space between thought and belief, is where freedom exists. Not freedom from having negative thoughts. You'll always have those because brains generate thoughts constantly, and some percentage will inevitably be negative. But freedom from being controlled by them, from treating them as accurate perceptions that must be believed and acted upon. The question, where's the evidence, also trains you to think more accurately about everything, not just about negative thoughts. You become more aware of how often your mind generates interpretations that feel like facts, how frequently you draw conclusions based on insufficient data, how readily you accept thoughts that confirm your existing beliefs, while dismissing or ignoring thoughts that challenge them. This broader shift toward evidence-based thinking rather than assumption-based thinking has effects far beyond just reducing negative thoughts. It makes you more effective in solving actual problems because you're working with accurate information, rather than with distorted interpretations. It improves your relationships, because you're responding to what people actually say and do, rather than to what you imagine they're thinking or feeling. It reduces anxiety because you're not constantly catastrophizing about imagined futures that rarely materialize. But here's what you must understand about why this question works when other approaches fail. Most techniques for dealing with negative thoughts either fight against them or try to avoid them. You argue with them, suppress them, distract yourself from them, replace them with positive thoughts. All of these approaches have the same fundamental problem. They leave the thought's claim to be representing truth unexamined. They accept that the thought might be true, which is why it needs to be fought against or avoided or replaced. The question, where's the evidence, works differently. It doesn't accept the thought's claim to truth. It examines whether that claim is justified, and in the examination, reveals that it almost never is. You're not fighting the thought. You're simply requiring it to meet the same standard you'd apply to any other claim. Show me the evidence. This approach also avoids the trap of trying to prove the opposite of the negative thought, which is what happens when you try to counter "I'm inadequate" with evidence of adequacy. That strategy keeps you trapped in the same framework the negative thought created, arguing about adequacy as if it were a real binary property rather than a distorted concept. When you ask, "Where's the evidence?" you're not trying to prove you're adequate. You're revealing that the entire framework of global judgments about adequacy or inadequacy is unsupported by evidence. You're sometimes skillful in some areas and less skillful in others. You succeed at some things and struggle with others. You're learning and growing in ongoing ways. None of this supports the absolute judgment inadequate, and recognizing this doesn't require you to adopt the equally distorted judgment adequate. It allows you to exit the framework entirely and see reality more accurately. You're a complex human being with strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures, areas of competence and areas where you're still developing, and none of this can be reduced to a single totalizing judgment. Beck found that this question also helps distinguish between thoughts that are genuinely worth attending to and thoughts that are just distorted negativity. Some negative thoughts actually do have evidential support and point to real problems that need addressing. If you think you're not preparing adequately for something important, and you examine the evidence and discover you genuinely haven't prepared, that's useful information. The thought is supported by evidence and suggests a concrete action. Prepare more. But if you think you're a complete failure, and you examine the evidence and discover you're basing this global judgment on one recent disappointment while ignoring years of successes, that reveals distortion rather than useful information. The question, "Where's the evidence?" helps you sort signal from noise, real concerns from habitual negativity. The transformation that occurs through practicing this question is both subtle and profound. You don't become someone who never has negative thoughts. You become someone who no longer automatically believes them. The thoughts still arise, but they've lost their authority, their ability to hijack your emotional state and dictate your behavior. You notice them, you ask for evidence, you discover they have none or that their evidence is far weaker than their certainty suggests, and you move on without being derailed by them. This is fundamentally different from suppressing negative thoughts or fighting against them. You're not at war with your thoughts. You're simply holding them to a basic standard of evidential support before you give them credibility. What makes this practice especially powerful is that it becomes faster with repetition. Initially, asking "Where's the evidence?" and examining the response takes conscious effort and attention. You have to deliberately pause, identify the thought, formulate the question, consider what evidence exists. But as you practice, the process becomes more automatic. A negative thought arises and almost immediately you find yourself asking, "Where's the evidence?" recognizing the lack of support and disengaging from the thought before it can generate significant emotional distress. The habit of believing negative thoughts automatically is gradually replaced by the habit of examining them first. And this new habit operates with the same speed and automaticity as the old one, but with completely different results. Beck's discovery of this single question represents a profound shift in how we understand psychological intervention. It reveals that the problem isn't negative thoughts themselves, it's uncritical acceptance of negative thoughts. Everyone has negative thoughts. The difference between people who suffer greatly from their thinking and people who don't isn't in the quantity or intensity of negative thoughts they experience. It's in whether they believe those thoughts automatically or examine them critically. And the good news is that critical examination is a learnable skill, one that can be developed through practice regardless of your history, your circumstances, or how long you've been trapped in patterns of negative thinking. The question, "Where's the evidence?" is also remarkably portable. You don't need a therapist present to ask it. You don't need any special equipment or circumstances. You just need a willingness to question your thoughts rather than automatically believing them. And that willingness can be exercised anywhere, anytime a negative thought arises. This makes the practice immediately accessible and continuously available, which is crucial because negative thoughts don't wait for convenient moments or therapeutic settings. They arise throughout the day in response to countless triggers, And having a tool that's always available, that you can deploy in the exact moment when a negative thought is trying to establish itself as truth, is what makes lasting change possible. The ultimate insight this question reveals is that your negative thoughts have been bluffing. They've been claiming to represent reality, to be accurate perceptions of yourself and your situation, but they've never been required to prove these claims. They've operated on authority alone, on the assumption that thoughts are facts and therefore don't need justification. The moment you start asking where's the evidence, the bluff is called. And what you discover is that the thoughts that have been tormenting you, that have felt so obviously true and so impossible to escape, collapse immediately when required to justify themselves. They have no foundation. They're not supported by reality. They're just habitual patterns of distorted thinking that have been running unchallenged for so long that they've come to feel like truth itself. This is the liberation Beck's work offers. Not a life without negative thoughts, but a life where negative thoughts no longer have unexamined authority over you, where you can hear a thought telling you you're inadequate or that your situation is hopeless, or that everyone is judging you, and instead of being overwhelmed by it, you can simply ask, where's the evidence? And when the thought has none, or when its evidence is revealed to be selective, distorted, and insufficient to support its sweeping claims, you can let it pass without giving it power over your emotional state or your actions. This is freedom not from the presence of negative thinking, but from its tyranny, from its ability to masquerade as truth and thereby control your life. And that freedom is available right now, immediately, through nothing more than a willingness to ask 3 words. Where's the evidence?